The alarm goes off at 6 a.m. You reach for your phone to hit snooze, stumble to the bathroom, check Instagram while the coffee brews. Same routine, same safe, predictable modern life. Now imagine this. It's 2 million years ago. You wake up because something is screaming in the darkness. Your shelter is a circle of stones barely keeping out the wind. Your hands look weird, halfway between ape and human. And outside, in the pre-dawn shadows, something with teeth the size of your fingers is deciding whether you're worth the effort to kill. Welcome to life as Homo Habilis, the handyman, the first member of our genus Homo, the species that started humanity's journey from the trees to the stars. And I'm going to tell you why you, with all your modern knowledge and skills, wouldn't last 24 hours in their world. So if these help you fall asleep or focus or whatever, subscribe maybe. Also drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time. Last video had someone from Perth saying 3 a.m. and Toronto at dinner time. The internet's bizarre. Here's what you need to understand right from the start. Everything you think you know about early humans is wrong. When you picture prehistoric people, you probably imagine cavemen, right? Hairy, hunched over, grunting, dragging clubs, living in dark caves. Total Hollywood fiction. Homo habilis wasn't some primitive ape creature stumbling around confused. They were sophisticated survivors operating at the absolute edge of what was possible for their biology and technology. They were problem solvers, innovators, the first creatures on Earth to fundamentally reshape their environment through manufactured tools. But they were also living in a world so hostile, so completely deadly, that modern humans wouldn't last a morning, not a week, not a day, a morning. The story begins 2.8 million years ago in East Africa. The planet is in the grip of climate chaos. The climate is oscillating wildly between wet and dry periods. Forests that had stood for millions of years are fragmenting, turning into patchy woodlands, then grasslands, then near desert. The animals that had dominated for ages are going extinct or evolving into new, more dangerous forms. And in the middle of all this chaos, something remarkable is happening. A line of ancient apes is transforming into something new. These weren't humans, not yet, but they weren't apes anymore either. They were caught in between, in that weird evolutionary middle ground where everything is changing fast, where survival depends on adaptation happening in real time across generations. Their bodies were changing, their brains were growing, and most importantly, they were learning to do something no creature had ever done before. They were making tools, not using tools. Lots of animals use tools. Chimps use sticks to fish for termites. Sea otters use rocks to crack open shells. Crows can solve multi-step puzzles, but making tools, deliberately shaping raw materials into specific forms designed for specific purposes, that was new. That was revolutionary. That was the beginning of technology itself. The first Homo habilis fossils were discovered in 1960 at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by Louis and Mary Leakey. When they announced the discovery in 1964, it caused a sensation. This was the oldest member of our own genus, the first creature that could legitimately be called human, even if barely. The name they chose, Homo habilis, literally means handyman or able man, because these fossils were found alongside the oldest known stone tools. Tools that would change everything. But who were these creatures really? What did they look like? How did they live? And why would modern humans struggle so badly in their world? Let's start with the basics. Physical appearance. If you could somehow meet a Homo habilis face to face, your first reaction would probably be confusion. They'd look wrong, uncanny, like someone tried to build a human but got the proportions all messed up. They were small, really small. Adults stood maybe 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall, about the height of a modern 8-year-old. They weighed between 70 and 110 pounds. You could probably bench press a Homo habilis if you had to, but don't let their size fool you. These were not weak creatures. They were lean, wiry, built for endurance rather than power. Their muscles attached differently than ours, giving them grip strength that would put modern rock climbers to shame. Their faces would immediately strike you as strange. The skull was more rounded than their Australopithecine ancestors, but still much more primitive than modern humans. Prominent brow ridges stuck out over their eyes like a permanent scowl. Their faces projected forward, not as much as apes, but definitely not flat like ours. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw was heavy and jutted out, with large teeth designed for chewing tough, fibrous foods. But here's what would really get you: the eyes. Homo habilis had the same forward-facing, white surrounding eyes that humans have. They could make eye contact. You could read emotions in those eyes: fear, curiosity, intelligence, because they were intelligent. Their brains were roughly 600 to 800 cubic centimeters. About twice the size of a chimpanzee's brain, but still only about half the size of yours. That's small enough to limit their cognitive abilities dramatically, but large enough to do things no other creature on Earth could do. Their bodies were a bizarre mix of features. Their arms were proportionally longer than modern humans, still showing their tree-climbing heritage. But their legs were longer and more human-like than their Australopithecine ancestors. Their hands were the really interesting part. They had opposable thumbs like us, but their fingers were curved, still adapted for gripping branches. This combination of features, human-like thumbs with ape-like finger bones, gave them a unique advantage. They could both climb trees reasonably well and manipulate objects with precision. This precision grip was everything. It's what allowed them to make tools. Try this sometime. Pick up a small stone. Now try to chip pieces off it by striking it with another stone at just the right angle, with just the right force to create sharp edges. It's incredibly difficult. It requires fine motor control, hand-eye coordination, and the ability to predict how the stone will fracture based on where and how hard you hit it. Homo habilis could do this consistently, creating tools that were far more sophisticated than anything their ancestors had made. But their physical appearance is only part of the story. What really matters is what life was actually like for these creatures. And that's where things get absolutely terrifying. Let's put you there. Right now, it's 1.8 million years ago. You wake up as the sun is just beginning to light the eastern sky. Except it's not really waking up, because you barely slept. Real sleep, the deep REM sleep modern humans need, wasn't possible. Because sleeping deeply meant dying. You're lying in a rough shelter, if you can even call it that. Maybe a windbreak made from piled branches and stones. Maybe a slight overhang in some rocks. Nothing substantial, because Homo habilis didn't build complex structures. They didn't have the cognitive ability to plan and execute architectural projects. They used what nature provided and made minimal modifications. Your bed is the hard ground, maybe with some grass or leaves piled underneath if you were lucky. No blankets, no pillows, no comfort. Your body aches from yesterday's exertions. Your feet are cut and bruised from walking barefoot across savanna and rocky terrain. You're hungry. You're always hungry. Because getting enough calories was a constant, desperate struggle. The moment your eyes open, your body floods with adrenaline. Because the first thing you have to do every single morning is check if you're about to die. You listen carefully. What sounds are coming from outside? Are there any large predators nearby? Is that rustling sound the wind or something moving through the grass toward you? You smell the air. Homo habilis had a much better sense of smell than modern humans. You could detect the scent of predators, the smell of nearby water, the indication of recent rain. Your survival depended on reading these environmental cues constantly. You slowly peek out from your shelter. The landscape before you is beautiful and deadly. The East African savanna, stretching in every direction, dotted with acacia trees and patches of woodland. The sun is rising over distant hills, painting the sky in oranges and reds. It looks like paradise. It's actually a death trap, because out there, in that beautiful landscape, are predators that make modern African wildlife look tame. We're not talking about lions and leopards, though there were ancient versions of those too. We're talking about creatures specifically evolved to hunt primates. Animals that learned over millions of years that upright apes made excellent prey. Dinophilis, the false saber-toothed cat, built like a leopard but bigger, stronger, with partially serrated teeth designed for slicing through skin and muscle. Fossil evidence shows these cats specifically targeted early hominins. They would ambush from trees or tall grass, going for the neck or spine in a killing bite that left distinctive marks on fossil skulls. We've found those marks on Homo habilis fossils. Meganterion, a true saber-toothed cat with 7-inch fangs. These weren't the massive, heavy saber-tooths from the Ice Age. These were smaller, more agile, built for hunting medium-sized prey like early humans. They could sprint at tremendous speed, leap from cover, and drive those massive teeth through ribs and into vital organs. Giant hyenas, 3 times the size of modern hyenas. Pack hunters with bone-crushing jaws that could bite through skulls. Smart enough to work together, patient enough to track prey for miles, strong enough to drag adult humans away to be eaten. Crocodiles in every river and lake, much larger than modern ones. Ancient eagles with 6-foot wingspans that could snatch children and small adults. Giant prehistoric snakes that could constrict an adult human to death in minutes. This was the morning threat assessment. Before you could think about finding food or water, before you could consider the day's activities, you had to determine if you were about to become food yourself. Let's say you survived the morning security check. Now comes the real challenge, finding breakfast. And this is where modern humans would immediately fail because you have no idea what you're looking for or how to get it. Homo habilis was primarily a scavenger and gatherer, with some hunting thrown in when opportunities arose. Notice I said scavenger first. These weren't apex predators. They couldn't take down large game animals. They were more likely to be prey than predator. So their strategy was different, more desperate, more opportunistic. The day starts with gathering plant foods. This is critical because plant foods provided the majority of calories. But here's the problem, you don't know which plants are edible. Modern humans have lost almost all knowledge of wild plant identification. If I dropped you in the African savanna right now and told you to find breakfast, you'd probably eat something poisonous within the first hour. Homo habilis knew hundreds of edible plant species. They knew which roots and tubers to dig up and when. They knew which fruits were ripe and which would make them sick. They knew which leaves, seeds, nuts and berries were safe and which were deadly. They knew which plants were edible only after specific preparation like cooking or soaking or grinding. This knowledge was the result of millions of years of trial and error, countless ancestors dying from eating the wrong things, so the survivors learned what to avoid. That knowledge was passed down through observation and imitation. Maybe some rudimentary teaching. Each individual carried a massive database of botanical information in their relatively small brains. You don't have that database. You'd be guessing, and guessing wrong meant stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, poisoning, death. Even if you survived eating poisonous plants, the illness would weaken you, making you vulnerable to predators or unable to keep up with your group. But let's say you somehow avoid poisonous plants. You're still facing another problem. The plants Homo habilis ate were nothing like modern domesticated foods. Wild tubers are tough, fibrous, often bitter. Wild fruits are small, mostly seed with little flesh. Wild nuts have incredibly hard shells. Everything requires serious effort to process and provides relatively few calories. Modern humans, with our domesticated foods, have no concept of how difficult it was to get enough calories from wild plants. An apple from the grocery store has been bred over thousands of years to be large, sweet, and fleshy. Wild apples are tiny, sour, and mostly core. A potato from the store is huge and starchy. Wild tubers are often the size of your thumb and taste like wood. Homo habilis spent hours every day just processing plant foods, digging up roots with wooden sticks or sharp stones, cracking nuts between rocks, grinding seeds with stone tools, chewing tough fibrous vegetation that required powerful jaws and large teeth. Your modern jaw, weakened by a lifetime of soft, processed foods, would literally fail. You'd get jaw pain, tooth damage, and still not be able to extract enough nutrition from these foods to survive. But plant foods alone weren't enough. Homo habilis needed animal protein, not just for calories, but for essential nutrients. Vitamin B12, which is only found in animal products. Omega-3 fatty acids, crucial for brain development. Complete proteins with all essential amino acids. Without these nutrients, even if you had enough calories, you'd slowly decline into malnutrition, disease, and eventually death. So how did Homo habilis get animal protein? Remember, they weren't effective hunters. They didn't have weapons beyond rocks and sticks. They couldn't outrun most prey animals. They were too small and weak to overpower anything substantial, so they scavenged. Scavenging means finding animals that died naturally or were killed by predators and stealing meat before other scavengers got it all. This sounds simple. It's actually an incredibly complex and dangerous activity that requires intelligence, courage, and perfect timing. Here's how it worked. Early in the morning, Homo habilis groups would move through their territory looking for signs of predator kills, vultures circling in the distance, the sounds of hyenas fighting over a carcass, the smell of death carried on the wind. When they found a kill site, they had to make a split-second decision. Is this opportunity worth the risk? Because scavenging is dangerous as hell. If the predator that made the kill is still nearby, approaching means potentially becoming the next kill. If other scavengers are feeding, they'll defend the carcass aggressively. Large scavengers like hyenas or prehistoric wolves can easily kill a human-sized primate. Even vultures can be dangerous in large numbers, and they're very territorial around carcasses. So the strategy was this: wait until the primary predator has eaten its fill and left. Wait until the large scavengers have had their turn, then moving quickly with the whole group, making noise to scare off smaller scavengers. Use stone tools to access the parts that other scavengers couldn't get. Then get out fast before something bigger shows up. This is where Homo habilis' stone tools became absolutely crucial. Large carnivores have teeth and jaws strong enough to crack bones and tear through thick hides. They eat the best parts, the organs, the muscle meat, the bone marrow. By the time they're done, what's left is mostly bones with bits of meat attached and hide that's too tough for most scavengers to penetrate. But Homo habilis had sharp stone flakes. These flakes, created by striking rocks together in just the right way, were sharp enough to cut through hide-and-slice meat from bones. They also had hammer stones that could break open long bones to access the marrow inside. This was the game changer. While other scavengers fought over scraps, Homo habilis could extract nutrition from parts of the carcass that nothing else could access. The marrow was particularly important. It's incredibly nutrient-dense, packed with fats and calories. It's also protected inside the bone shaft, so it stays fresh longer than exposed meat. A large antelope bone could provide significant calories if you could get to the marrow inside, but breaking open these bones required the right tools and technique. You had to know where to strike the bone so it would crack without shattering into unusable fragments. This is sophisticated behavior. This is tool use combined with anatomical knowledge combined with proper technique. This requires learning, practice, and some level of teaching. Young Homo habilis didn't instinctively know how to do this. They had to watch adults, practice, fail repeatedly, and eventually develop the skills themselves. But here's where it gets really interesting. Recent research has found evidence that Homo habilis might have been more than just scavengers. Some fossil sites show cut marks on bones from animals that were clearly killed by predators, but the cut marks were made before the predator tooth marks. This suggests something absolutely wild. Homo habilis might have been practicing confrontational scavenging. Confrontational scavenging means actively driving predators away from kills and stealing the carcass while it's still fresh, while the best parts are still available. This requires serious courage and coordination. You can't do this alone. You need a group willing to face down large carnivores, make threatening gestures, throw rocks, use noise and aggression to convince a predator that the meal isn't worth fighting for. Imagine being part of that group. You've spotted a leopard in a tree with a freshly killed antelope. The leopard has eaten some, but most of the carcass is intact. This is a huge opportunity. More meat than your group will find scavenging for a week. But to get it, you have to convince that leopard to give up its kill. You gather your group. 10, maybe 15 individuals. You arm yourselves with rocks and sticks. You approach the tree shouting, making yourselves look bigger, throwing stones at the leopard. The leopard snarls, shows its teeth, swipes at the air with claws that could disembowel you with a single strike. But you keep advancing, keep threatening, keep maintaining the pressure. If it works, the leopard decides the meal isn't worth the effort and retreats. You quickly climb up, cut off as much meat as you can carry and run before the leopard returns with backup or another predator shows up. If it doesn't work, the leopard attacks. Someone dies. the group flees, and you've learned a hard lesson about risk assessment. This kind of behavior requires extraordinary bravery, especially considering Homo habilis' physical limitations. They weren't big, they weren't strong, they didn't have natural weapons like fangs or claws. All they had was numbers, intelligence, and the willingness to face down creatures that could kill them effortlessly. Would you have that bravery? Could you charge at a leopard with nothing but rocks and sticks, knowing that one mistake means you or someone in your group dies screaming? Most modern humans raised in safety and comfort would freeze in terror or run, probably run, but for Homo habilis, this was Tuesday. This was normal. This was how you got breakfast. Now let's talk about the tools themselves, because this is where Homo habilis truly shines. These weren't crude rocks banged together randomly. These were sophisticated implements that required real skill to create and use. The oldest tools associated with Homo habilis are called Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai Gorge, where they were first discovered. These tools date back to about 2.6 million years ago and represent the dawn of human technology. They look simple, just rocks with sharp edges, but creating them is anything but simple. To make an Oldowan tool, you need three things: the right type of stone, the physical ability to strike it correctly, and the mental understanding of how stone fractures. Let's break this down. First, stone selection. Not all rocks work for tool making. You need stone that fractures in predictable ways, creating sharp edges. The best materials are fine-grained rocks like flint, chert, obsidian, or quartzite. These stones have a conchoidal fracture pattern, meaning when you strike them, they break in smooth, curved surfaces with sharp edges. Homo habilis had to know where to find these stones. They had to recognize them by sight and feel. They had to understand that a stream bed with certain geological features would have good tool stone while another location wouldn't. This is practical geology, understanding the structure of your landscape well enough to predict where resources will be. Then comes the actual tool making. You hold a large stone called a core in one hand. You strike it with another stone called a hammerstone at precisely the right angle with precisely the right force. If you do it correctly, a flake breaks off the core with a sharp edge. That flake can be used as a cutting tool. The core, now with a sharp edge, where the flake was removed, can also be used as a tool. Strike the core from different angles, and you can create multiple sharp edges on one stone. Sounds simple? Try it sometime. I'm serious. If you can do it safely and legally, try to make an Oldowan tool. You'll quickly discover it's incredibly difficult. If you strike too softly, nothing happens. Too hard, and the stone shatters into useless fragments. Wrong angle, and the flake breaks off in the wrong place or with the wrong shape. Modern archaeologists who study ancient tool making spend months learning these techniques. Even with instruction and practice, many people never develop real proficiency. Yet every adult Homo habilis could do this. They could evaluate a piece of raw stone, plan where to strike it, execute the strikes correctly, and produce a functional tool within minutes. This is complex sensoromotor coordination combined with spatial reasoning and practical physics knowledge. But tool making was just the first step. Using the tools correctly required another set of skills. A stone flake has sharp edges, but it also has limitations. It's not like a modern knife with a handle and a single blade. It's a chunk of sharp rock that can cut you as easily as it cuts your food. You have to learn how to hold it without cutting yourself, how to apply pressure without the edge crumbling, how to use different parts of the edge for different tasks. Homo habilis developed entire toolkits with different implements for different purposes. Choppers for heavy butchering work, breaking through thick hides and heavy joints, scrapers for removing meat from bones and processing hides, sharp flakes for precision cutting, hammerstones for breaking open bones. Each tool represented hours of accumulated knowledge about form and function, and they carried these tools with them. This is crucial. Unlike animals that use tools opportunistically, picking up sticks or stones when needed and discarding them when done, Homo habilis manufactured tools and transported them. They planned ahead, making tools before they needed them and carrying them to where they would be useful. This is called curation in archaeology, and it represents a major cognitive leap. Planning ahead requires thinking about the future. It requires imagining situations that haven't happened yet and preparing for them. It requires understanding that the effort invested now in tool making will pay off later when you find a carcass and need to process it quickly. This is abstract thinking, temporal reasoning, the kind of mental processing that separates tool users from tool makers. But having good tools didn't make life easy. It made life possible. There's a difference. Let's continue with your day as Homo habilis. It's now mid-morning. You've managed to find some edible plants, maybe scavenged a few scraps of meat from a hyena kill. You're still hungry. You're always hungry. But the immediate threat of starvation has been pushed back another day. Now comes another challenge that modern humans would struggle with enormously. Water. You take clean, safe water completely for granted. Turn on a tap, water comes out, buy a bottle, drink it, throw it away. You probably don't think twice about hydration. Homo habilis thought about it constantly because finding safe water was a matter of life and death. The East African savanna 2 million years ago wasn't a desert, but it wasn't consistently wet either. There were periods of intense drought lasting months or even years. Water sources were scattered, unreliable, and often dangerous. Lakes, rivers, streams, springs, each had its own risks and benefits. Large permanent water sources like lakes attracted game animals, which attracted predators, which made them incredibly dangerous. Crocodiles waited at the water's edge for drinking animals. Big cats ambushed prey at waterholes. Herbivores congregated in large numbers, drawing carnivores like magnets. Homo habilis had to balance the need for water against the risk of predation. The strategy was usually to approach large water sources during midday when it was hottest and most predators were resting. Come in groups making noise to announce your presence. Never turn your back to the water. Crocodiles are ambush predators. Fill containers if you have them, probably ostrich eggshells or animal bladders, so you don't have to return as frequently. Smaller water sources were safer but less reliable. Streams could dry up between visits, springs could become contaminated, standing water could carry diseases. Homo habilis had to learn which water sources were safe, which were seasonal, and where to find water when obvious sources weren't available. They probably knew tricks for finding hidden water, digging in dry riverbeds where water flows underground, following animals or insect behavior that indicated nearby water, reading vegetation patterns that showed underground moisture. These are sophisticated wilderness survival techniques that most modern humans don't know and couldn't learn quickly enough to survive. Water quality was another issue. Standing water could contain parasites, bacteria, all sorts of pathogens that cause disease. Running water was generally safer, but not always. Homo habilis probably couldn't understand the concept of germs or disease transmission, but they learned through experience which water sources made people sick and which didn't. And you need a lot of water in the hot African climate. Modern humans in similar environments need 2 to 4 liters per day, more if physically active. You're walking miles every day, often in intense heat. You're sweating constantly. Dehydration is a constant threat. Without reliable hydration, your physical and mental performance deteriorates rapidly. After losing just 2% of your body weight in water, your cognitive abilities decline. Decision-making becomes impaired. Reaction times slow. After 5% water loss, you experience severe fatigue, dizziness, and confusion. After 10%, you're in serious medical danger. At 15 to 20%, you're dead. Homo habilis had to maintain constant awareness of hydration status, not just for themselves, but for the entire group. Elders and children were especially vulnerable. A mother with a nursing infant needed significantly more water. Someone injured or sick could dehydrate rapidly. Managing the group's water needs was a complex logistical challenge that required planning, cooperation, and detailed environmental knowledge. Modern humans, accustomed to unlimited clean water, would struggle enormously with this aspect of Homo habilis life. You'd probably misjudge your hydration needs, wait too long between drinks, or make poor decisions about which water sources to use. By the time you realized you were seriously dehydrated, you'd already be cognitively impaired and possibly unable to remedy the situation. So you've survived the morning. You found some food, located water, avoided predators. Now it's afternoon, and this is when things get really interesting, because this is when Homo habilis had time for social interaction, learning, and cultural transmission. One of the biggest misconceptions about early humans is that they spent all their time desperately struggling for survival with no time for anything else. The archaeological evidence suggests something different. Like modern hunter-gatherers, Homo habilis probably spent 4 to 6 hours per day on direct survival activities: hunting, gathering, tool making, and the rest of their time on social activities. What did they do with that time? This is where we start to see the foundations of human culture emerging. They almost certainly had some form of communication, probably more sophisticated than anything their Australopithecine ancestors used. We don't know if Homo habilis had language in the sense we understand it. Their vocal anatomy was still quite different from modern humans, limiting the sounds they could produce. Their brains, while larger than their ancestors, probably lacked some of the specialized language areas that modern human brains have. But they definitely communicated. Coordinating group activities, like confrontational scavenging, requires communication. Teaching young individuals how to make tools requires demonstrating techniques and correcting errors. Warning the group about dangers requires specific, meaningful signals. They probably had a proto-language, a communication system more complex than ape vocalizations and gestures, but less complex than modern human language. Maybe a vocabulary of a few hundred specific sounds and gestures. Maybe simple syntax, basic ways of combining signals to create new meanings. Maybe no past or future tense, just immediate experiences and concrete objects. This communication system would be used extensively during the afternoon social time. Adults would teach children by demonstration, showing them how to make tools, identify edible plants, read animal tracks. There would be social grooming, physical contact that builds bonds and establishes social hierarchies. There would be play, especially among juveniles, that serves to practice important survival skills in a lower risk environment. And there was probably something like storytelling, though not in the complex narrative form we know. Maybe reenactments of that morning's successful scavenging, maybe gestures and sounds describing a dangerous encounter with a predator, maybe demonstrations of techniques for finding water or tracking game. These weren't entertainment, they were information transfer, the accumulated wisdom of the group being passed to the next generation. This cultural transmission is absolutely critical to understanding Homo habilis. They weren't just using genetic evolution to adapt to their environment. They were using cultural evolution, learning and teaching behaviors that improved survival. This is why bigger brains were being selected for, not just to solve problems individually, but to learn from others, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to benefit from discoveries made by long-dead ancestors. The afternoon social time was also when group cohesion was maintained. Homo habilis lived in groups of probably 20 to 50 individuals, all of whom needed to cooperate for survival. But cooperation doesn't come naturally. There are always conflicts over resources, mates, status within the group. Managing these conflicts without the group fracturing required sophisticated social skills. They probably had dominance hierarchies like other primates, with stronger, older individuals having priority access to resources. But these hierarchies had to be balanced against the need for cooperation. A purely dominance-based system wouldn't work because successful scavenging and predator defense required everyone to participate, not just the strongest individuals. So there had to be mechanisms for conflict resolution, probably based on social bonds, kinship relationships, and coalition formation. This is complex social maneuvering that requires theory of mind, understanding that others have thoughts and motivations different from your own, and modeling how they might respond to your actions. Modern humans struggle with this level of social complexity even with our much larger brains and sophisticated language. You'd be navigating Homo habilis social dynamics blind, missing signals, misinterpreting interactions, probably making social mistakes that would get you ostracized from the group. And being ostracized from the group meant death. You couldn't survive alone. As afternoon turns to evening, a new set of challenges emerges because the most dangerous time of day is coming. Dusk. This is when most predators are most active, when visibility drops, when Homo habilis is at maximum disadvantage. Diurnal predators like eagles and some big cats make their final hunts before dark. Nocturnal predators are waking up and starting to hunt. The lighting is dim enough that Homo habilis' eyesight, designed for daylight, becomes less effective. But it's still light enough that predators can see perfectly well. The evening routine was critical. Return to the sleeping site while there's still enough light to see clearly. Secure the area as much as possible. Gather fuel for the fire. Wait, did Homo habilis have fire? This is one of the biggest debates in paleoanthropology. The earliest clear evidence of controlled fire use is much later, around 1 million years ago. But some researchers think Homo habilis might have been using fire opportunistically, carrying embers from natural fires like lightning strikes and maintaining them for extended periods. If they had fire, it would have been a huge advantage. Fire provides warmth in the cool nights. It provides light extending the active hours into darkness. Most importantly, it provides protection. Large predators are afraid of fire. A well-maintained fire creates a zone of safety where the group can sleep with reduced vigilance. If they didn't have fire, nights were terrifying. Complete darkness, sounds of predators moving through the landscape, the knowledge that something might attack at any moment. Sleep would be light, fragmented, constantly interrupted by every sound and movement. They probably slept in trees when possible, building simple platforms of branches high enough that ground predators couldn't reach them. Or they slept in rocky areas where defensible positions could be established, always in groups, never alone. Always with some individuals staying somewhat alert, providing a rudimentary watch system. But even in the safest sleeping sites, nights were dangerous. Infant mortality was probably astronomical. Disease, predation, accident, starvation all took their toll. Most individuals probably didn't survive to adulthood. Those who did had survived dozens, hundreds of near-death experiences. Every adult Homo Habilis was a survivor in ways that modern humans can barely comprehend. And you wouldn't be. The first night, maybe you'd get lucky. Maybe predators would be hunting elsewhere. Maybe you'd find a decent sleeping spot, but eventually your luck would run out. You'd make a mistake. You'd eat something poisonous. You'd miss the signs of a stalking predator. You'd fail to defend yourself adequately. You'd succumb to disease or injury that would be minor with modern medicine, but was fatal then. The harsh truth is that modern humans, with all our knowledge and intelligence, are fundamentally unsuited for life as Homo Habilis. We've lost the physical abilities, the sensory acuity, the environmental knowledge, the social skills, and the mental toughness that made survival possible in that world. But understanding this makes Homo Habilis even more remarkable. These weren't failures or primitive throwbacks. They were pioneers, the first members of our genus, the ancestors who began the journey that would eventually lead to us. Every advantage we have today, our big brains, our complex language, our sophisticated technology, all of it traces back to the survival challenges that Homo Habilis faced and overcame. They lived in a world that would kill modern humans within days. They not only survived, but thrived, spreading across East Africa, developing new technologies, growing their brains, improving their tools. They set in motion the evolutionary processes that would eventually produce Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and finally us. So when you think about Homo Habilis, don't picture primitive cavemen. Picture courageous innovators living on the absolute edge of possibility. Picture intelligent problem solvers facing challenges that would defeat us. Picture the first humans walking upright across the African savanna, stone tools in hand, taking the first steps towards civilization. Because that's what they really were, and we owe them everything. But the story doesn't end with a single day's survival. To really understand why modern humans couldn't handle life as Homo Habilis, we need to go deeper into the specific challenges they faced and the incredible solutions they developed, because every aspect of their existence required skills and knowledge that we've completely lost. Let's talk about predation in more detail, because this is probably the single biggest difference between then and now. Modern humans live in a world where we are the apex predators. We're at the top of the food chain. Nothing hunts us. We hunt everything else. This has been true for so long that we've lost all instincts and abilities related to being prey. Homo habilis was prey. They were absolutely, definitely, constantly at risk of being killed and eaten. The fossil record makes this clear. Many Homo habilis fossils show predator tooth marks. Some show signs of having been chewed and processed by carnivores. Ancient humans weren't occasional prey. They were a regular part of the diet for multiple predator species. Think about what this means psychologically. You wake up every morning knowing that today might be the day you get eaten. Every shadow could be a stalking cat. Every rustle in the grass could be an ambush. You can never fully relax, never completely let your guard down, because the moment you do, you might die. This requires a completely different mental state than anything modern humans experience. The closest analogy might be soldiers in combat zones, but even that doesn't capture it. In combat, there are moments of safety, secure areas where you can relax. For Homo habilis, there were no secure areas. The entire world was a combat zone 24/7 for their entire lives. The psychological adaptations required for this are profound. You need to maintain high vigilance without burning out mentally. You need to accurately assess threats without becoming paralyzed by fear. You need to make split-second decisions about when to flee, when to fight, when to freeze. Get it wrong, and you die. Modern humans raised in safety would likely fail at this immediately. We'd either be too cautious, wasting energy on false alarms and unnecessary flight responses, or we'd be too complacent, missing real threats until too late. Finding the right balance between vigilance and efficiency takes years of experience learning to read the environment, understanding predator behavior, recognizing actual threats versus false alarms. And it's not just about avoiding predators. Homo habilis had to actively deal with them. Remember confrontational scavenging? They were deliberately approaching kills guarded by dangerous carnivores and trying to steal meat. This requires suppressing every natural instinct that says run away from the thing with big teeth. It also requires sophisticated understanding of predator behavior and psychology. Which predators can be intimidated and which can't? How do different species react to threats? What signals indicate a predator is likely to attack versus likely to retreat? When is a predator defending a kill versus simply eating? What time of day are different predators most dangerous? This is complex ecological knowledge that takes years to develop. Young Homo habilis would learn by watching adults, by participating in low-risk encounters first, gradually building up the experience and confidence needed for more dangerous situations. By the time they were adults, they'd have an intuitive understanding of predator behavior that modern animal behaviorists would envy. But even with all this knowledge and experience, things went wrong. Individuals died. Frequently. The life expectancy of Homo habilis was probably around 30 years if you made it past childhood, which many didn't. Infant and juvenile mortality was likely over 50%. For every adult Homo habilis, there were multiple siblings who died young. This creates a completely different relationship with death than modern humans have. Death wasn't a distant, rare tragedy. It was a constant companion. You probably witnessed deaths regularly. Family members, friends, members of your group. You probably lost children if you had them. You certainly lost parents, siblings, cousins. How do you process that psychologically? How do you maintain motivation and hope when death is so present and constant. This is where we start to see the roots of things that would later become fundamental to human culture: ritual, belief systems, ways of processing loss and maintaining meaning in the face of constant tragedy. We don't know if Homo habilis had any kind of spiritual beliefs or rituals. Their brains were probably not quite sophisticated enough for the abstract thinking that religion requires, but they may have had proto-rituals, simple behaviors around death and loss that helped maintain group cohesion and individual psychological health. And psychological health was critical because the stresses didn't stop. Beyond predation, there was disease. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without even basic hygiene, disease was rampant and deadly. Bacterial infections from cuts and wounds could turn fatal within days. Parasitic infections from contaminated water or raw meat caused chronic illness and death. Viral infections spread through groups, killing the young, old, and weak. Dental problems without modern dentistry could lead to infections that spread to the brain or bloodstream. Injuries that would be minor annoyances today could be fatal then. A sprained ankle that limits mobility makes you vulnerable to predators and unable to keep up with your group. A broken bone that doesn't heal properly could cripple you for life. Even minor illnesses that reduce your stamina and awareness make you easier prey. Homo habilis had some knowledge of plant medicines. We know this because we can observe modern primates using certain plants to treat illness, and many traditional cultures have extensive pharmaceutical knowledge based on wild plants. But their medical knowledge was limited. They couldn't treat serious infections, couldn't repair severe injuries, couldn't prevent or cure most diseases. The result was a constant attrition rate. People got sick and died, got injured and died, got old and weak and died. The group size would fluctuate as deaths reduced numbers and births slowly replaced lost members. During bad periods, droughts, or disease outbreaks or intense predator pressure, groups could dwindle to dangerously low numbers. Small group sizes created their own problems. Genetic diversity suffered. Knowledge could be lost if key individuals died before passing it on. Defense against predators became harder. Finding mates outside the immediate family group became difficult. This is where the larger social networks became crucial. Homo habilis groups weren't isolated. They were part of regional populations that occasionally came into contact. When groups met, several important things happened. First, information exchange. Groups would share knowledge about resource locations, predator activity, tool-making techniques, anything that improved survival. This created a larger pool of collective knowledge that benefited everyone. Second, mate exchange. To avoid inbreeding, groups needed to exchange members. Usually young adults would leave their birth group and join another group, bringing genetic diversity and new perspectives. This was probably formalized in some way, maybe simple trade agreements or maybe more complex social arrangements. Third, alliance formation. Having friendly relations with neighboring groups provided mutual benefits. Help during crises, backup when facing large predators or hostile groups, combined defense of important resources. These alliances were probably maintained through regular contact, shared rituals or practices, and reciprocal obligations. But not all intergroup encounters were friendly. Competition over resources could turn violent. When two groups wanted the same hunting territory or watering hole, conflict was likely. These conflicts were probably brutal and total. Archaeological evidence from later periods shows that prehistoric warfare was more more deadly than most modern warfare. When you can't retreat to safe territory and have no medical care, even minor injuries sustained in combat often proved fatal. Homo Habilis groups probably tried to avoid direct conflict when possible, using threats and displays rather than actual violence. But when resources were scarce enough and stakes high enough, they fought. And they fought with the same intelligence and ferocity they applied to everything else. Now let's talk about something modern humans would find almost unimaginable: child rearing in the Homo habilis world. If you think raising kids is hard now, imagine doing it without any modern infrastructure, medicine, or safety. Homo habilis infants were helpless, like modern human babies. They couldn't walk, couldn't feed themselves, couldn't regulate their temperature effectively. They required constant care and attention. But providing that care in the dangerous Homo habilis world was extraordinarily difficult. Mothers had to carry infants constantly because there was no safe place to leave them. A baby left alone for even a minute could be taken by a predator, bitten by a snake, or injured in countless ways. So mothers carried their babies everywhere all the time, while also gathering food, processing materials, and participating in group activities. This required immense physical stamina. Carrying a growing baby while walking miles each day, climbing, bending, working, all while maintaining the vigilance necessary to avoid predators. Modern mothers complain about carrying babies around the house. Homo habilis mothers did it all day, every day, for years, in life-threatening conditions. Breastfeeding created additional challenges. Mothers needed extra calories to produce milk, but resources were often scarce. Nursing infants required frequent feeding every few hours, which disrupted other activities, and breastfeeding lasted for years because there were no baby foods, no safe alternatives. Children probably nursed until age 3 or 4, maybe longer. This long nursing period had consequences. It spaced out births because nursing suppresses ovulation. Homo habilis women probably had babies every 4 to 5 years, maybe longer. Combined with high infant mortality, this meant population growth was very slow. Groups couldn't quickly recover from losses. Each birth was precious, each surviving child a celebration. As children grew, they transitioned from being liabilities to assets. By age 5 or 6, they could start contributing to food gathering, help with simple tasks, watch younger children. By age 10, they could perform many adult tasks, though not as efficiently. By age 15, they were effectively adults, fully integrated into the group's survival activities. But education during this period wasn't formal. There were no schools, no structured lessons. Children learned by watching adults, by imitating, by trial and error. This seems primitive, but it was actually incredibly effective for teaching practical skills. You don't learn to make stone tools by reading about it. You learn by watching experts, trying it yourself, getting feedback, practicing until you master it. The same applied to all survival skills. Plant identification, animal tracking, predator awareness, social navigation, everything. Children absorbed this knowledge through constant immersion in the adult world. By the time they reached adulthood, they had thousands of hours of experience in every aspect of survival. Modern education, by contrast, mostly teaches abstract knowledge disconnected from immediate application. We learn math, history, and literature in classrooms, then maybe apply some of it later, maybe not. Homo habilis children learned skills they would use immediately and constantly for the rest of their lives. The relevance was obvious, the motivation intrinsic. But this also meant that children faced real dangers. They weren't protected in safe environments. They were in the same dangerous world as adults, just with less experience and capability. Many didn't survive to adulthood. Those who did had already proven themselves survivors. Let's shift to something modern humans would find bizarre and disturbing: the total absence of privacy and personal space. You've been alone in a room, right? Alone in a house, alone in a car, alone with your thoughts and personal space. This is so normal to modern life that we don't think about it. Homo habilis was never alone. Never. From birth to death, you were always surrounded by members of your group. You slept in groups. You traveled in groups. You ate in groups. You worked in groups. There was no concept of privacy, no personal space, no alone time. This was survival necessity. Being alone meant being vulnerable. An individual, Homo habilis, separated from the group, was easy prey, unable to defend against predators or find enough food efficiently. So groups stayed together constantly, maintaining visual and auditory contact even when spread out during foraging. This constant proximity created intense social pressure. Every action was observed. Every mistake was witnessed. Social standing within the group was constantly reinforced through interaction and observation. There was no escape from the social hierarchy, no way to reset or avoid the consequences of social missteps. For modern humans used to privacy and personal space, this would be psychologically crushing. The constant social monitoring, the inability to ever be alone with your thoughts, the unending need to navigate group dynamics without respite. Most people would crack under this pressure within days or weeks. But for Homo habilis, this was normal. They probably couldn't even conceive of being alone as anything other than a terrifying emergency situation. The group was everything: safety, identity, survival, meaning. This brings us to another aspect of Homo habilis life that's hard for modern humans to grasp: the total absence of abstract future planning. Modern humans spend enormous energy thinking about the future, planning months or years ahead, saving for retirement, preparing for potential scenarios that might never happen. Homo habilis almost certainly didn't think this way. Their cognitive abilities, while advanced compared to other animals, were still limited. They could plan ahead on short timescales. We should make tools now so we'll have them when we find a carcass tomorrow. But complex, long-term planning probably wasn't possible. They lived much more in the present than we do. Their focus was on immediate survival. Where's food today? Where's water? Where are predators? What's the group doing? Planning beyond a few days was probably beyond their cognitive abilities. This might sound limiting, but it also meant they didn't carry the psychological burden of long-term anxiety that modern humans do. They weren't worried about career trajectories or retirement planning or global politics. Their concerns were immediate and concrete, which in some ways might have been psychologically healthier. But it also meant they couldn't make the kind of long-term preparations that could significantly improve survival. They couldn't plan migrations months in advance, couldn't prepare for seasonal changes by storing food extensively, couldn't develop strategies that required multi-year patience. Their innovations happened incrementally, each generation making small improvements to tools and techniques, but without anyone consciously directing toward a long-term goal. Evolution was doing the planning through natural selection, favoring groups that stumbled upon better strategies. Now, let's talk about something that would shock modern humans: the total absence of property and accumulation. You probably own hundreds of things: clothes, electronics, furniture, decorations, tools, toys, books, all sorts of stuff. You probably have way more possessions than you actually need. Homo habilis owned almost nothing: a few stone tools that they made themselves, maybe a carrying bag made from hide or plant fibers, maybe a digging stick. That was it. Everything they owned had to be carried everywhere they went because they were nomadic, constantly moving to follow resources. This created a completely different relationship with material goods. Things weren't owned, they were used. A stone tool wasn't precious, it was functional. When it broke or became dull, you made another one. There was no accumulation, no hoarding, no possessions beyond what was immediately useful. This might sound freeing to modern people drowning in stuff, but it also meant extreme vulnerability. You couldn't stockpile food for hard times, couldn't accumulate tools for specialized tasks, couldn't build permanent structures that would shelter you through bad weather. Everything had to be immediately portable and functional. The lack of accumulation also meant no wealth inequality in the modern sense. Everyone had roughly the same material possessions: a few tools, some carrying capacity, that's it. Status within the group was based on other factors: physical ability, social skills, knowledge, age, kin relationships. But this egalitarianism in material possessions didn't mean perfect equality. There were still hierarchies, still power dynamics. Stronger individuals had advantages in conflicts. Individuals with more kin support had more social power. Skilled toolmakers or effective hunters had higher status. These status differences mattered enormously because group living meant constant negotiation over resources, mates, decision-making. Who got the best sleeping spot? Who got priority access to scavenged meat? Who made decisions about where the group moved? All of this was determined by social standing. Modern humans, raised in relatively egalitarian societies with formal rules and laws, would struggle enormously with the fluid, personality-based hierarchies of Homo habilis groups. You'd be starting at the bottom, a stranger with no kin support, limited skills, and no established relationships. Building your way up to even moderate status would take years if you survived that long. Let's talk about language again, because this is crucial to understanding Homo habilis cognition and why modern humans would struggle. You think in language. Your internal monologue, your planning, your processing of complex ideas, all of it relies on sophisticated language with extensive vocabulary and complex grammar. Homo habilis almost certainly didn't have this. Their vocal tract was still somewhat similar to apes, limiting the range of sounds they could produce. Their brains, while larger than their ancestors, lacked the extensive language processing areas that modern human brains have. What they probably had was a proto-language, a collection of meaningful sounds and gestures, maybe a few hundred distinct signals, simple combinations to create new meanings, but no complex grammar. No abstract concepts, no past or future tense, no ability to discuss hypotheticals or imaginary scenarios. Try to imagine thinking without language as you know it. You can't think about tomorrow because you don't have the linguistic tools to conceptualize a time that isn't now. You can't discuss abstract ideas because you don't have words for concepts like justice or potential or if-then conditionals. Your thinking would be much more concrete, bound to immediate sensory experience and direct action. You'd think in images, feelings, and immediate associations rather than in words and sentences. This isn't stupidity, it's a different mode of cognition entirely. For modern humans, losing access to language-based thought would be like losing a sense. You'd feel cognitively crippled, unable to think through complex problems, unable to plan effectively, unable to communicate nuanced ideas. You'd be trapped in immediacy in ways that would be psychologically devastating, but for Homo Habilis, this was normal. They didn't miss language because they'd never had it. Their cognition worked differently, processing information through other channels, building understanding through direct experience and observation rather than through linguistic abstraction. This meant their knowledge was largely procedural rather than declarative. They knew how to do things, but couldn't necessarily explain how or why. They could make a perfect stone tool, but couldn't tell you the physics of stone fracture. They could track animals, but couldn't describe the abstract principles of tracking. Knowledge was embodied in action rather than stored in words. For teaching, this meant demonstration and imitation were everything. You couldn't explain how to make a tool, you had to show them and they had to practice until their hands learned the motions. This is actually a very effective way to learn physical skills, better than verbal instruction alone. But it's limited to concrete, observable actions. Abstract knowledge, like planning strategies or understanding cause and effect over long time scales, was much harder to teach and learn. Each individual had to figure out many things for themselves through trial and error. Innovation was slow because good ideas couldn't be easily communicated and spread. This is why the archaeological record shows such slow technological change during the Homo habilis period. The older one tool technology remained basically unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, not because they couldn't innovate, but because innovations couldn't spread efficiently without language. Let's talk about something else modern humans take for granted: seasons and seasonal planning. You know that winter is coming months before it arrives. You buy winter clothes, maybe stock up on supplies, adjust your activities. You can think abstractly about future seasons and prepare accordingly. Homo habilis lived in tropical and subtropical East Africa, where seasons were less extreme than in temperate zones, but there were still significant seasonal variations. Wet seasons and dry seasons, times of plenty and times of scarcity. Understanding and preparing for these seasonal changes was critical for survival. But without complex language and abstract temporal thinking, how did they manage this? They probably relied on environmental cues and learned associations. When certain plants flowered, it meant the wet season was coming. When certain animals migrated, it meant dry season was approaching. They'd learned through experience that certain seasons brought certain opportunities and challenges. Wet season meant more plant foods, but also more mosquitoes and disease. Dry season meant concentrated water sources attracting both game and predators. These associations were learned and remembered, guiding behavior without requiring abstract reasoning about future time. But they probably couldn't plan very far ahead. Maybe a few weeks at most. They couldn't think, 6 months from now it will be dry season, so we should start preparing now. Instead, they responded to immediate cues that the season was changing and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This reactive rather than proactive approach meant they were often caught unprepared by sudden changes. An early dry season could catch them in areas without sufficient water. A delayed wet season could extend food scarcity beyond their ability to cope. They adapted as best they could, but couldn't anticipate and prevent these crises. Modern humans used to long-term planning and preparation would find this incredibly stressful. We like to feel in control, to anticipate problems and solve them before they become critical. Living reactively, responding to crises rather than preventing them, would trigger constant anxiety. Now let's address something dark but important: violence within groups. Modern society has laws, police, courts, systems for managing conflict and punishing violence. These institutions allow us to live together in large groups with relative safety. Homo habilis had none of this. There were no external authorities, no formal justice systems, no way to appeal to higher powers when conflicts arose. The group had to police itself, and that self-policing was probably brutal and immediate. If two individuals came into conflict over resources, mates, or status, resolution came through the group's informal hierarchy. Stronger individuals could dominate weaker ones. Individuals with more kin support could leverage that advantage. Physical violence was probably common, constrained only by the risk of injury and the need to maintain enough group cohesion for survival. Serious transgressions like killing another group member, stealing resources, or threatening group survival would probably result in harsh punishment, maybe exile, maybe death. The group couldn't afford to maintain order through lenient measures. Survival was too precarious. This created a very different moral framework than modern humans are used to. Actions weren't judged by abstract principles of right and wrong, but by their impact on group survival and harmony. Something that threatened the group was bad, regardless of the perpetrator's intentions. Something that strengthened the group was good, regardless of how we might judge it morally today. For modern humans, this would be psychologically difficult. We're raised with abstract moral principles, ideas about fairness and justice that transcend immediate survival needs. We'd be constantly troubled by the harsh realities of Homo habilis justice, uncomfortable with the violence and inequality that were normal parts of their world. But judging them by our standards misses the point. They weren't immoral. They were operating under different constraints. When your group's survival hangs by a thread, when every member's contribution matters and every conflict could fracture the group fatally, harsh measures make practical sense. Let's talk about something completely alien to modern experience, living without any sense of progress or history. You know that humans have advanced over time. You can look back at history and see how things have changed, improved, developed. You have a sense of trajectory, of being part of a larger historical process. Homo habilis had no concept of this. They didn't know they were early humans. Didn't know that their descendants would eventually develop language, art, civilization. They had no sense that things could be fundamentally different than they were. The world had always been this way, would always be this way. They might have had oral traditions about the recent past, stories about significant events in living memory, but these weren't historical in our sense. They were immediate, personal, lacking any sense of deep time or long-term change. This might sound limiting, but it also meant they didn't carry the psychological burden of existential questions that plague modern humans. They didn't wonder about the meaning of life or their place in the universe. Their purpose was obvious and immediate. Survive today, help the group survive, raise offspring if possible. That was it. No crisis of meaning, no existential angst. In some ways, this might have been psychologically simpler and healthier than the modern human condition, but it also meant they couldn't imagine alternatives to their current existence, couldn't work toward improving conditions beyond immediate survival, couldn't build toward a better future because they couldn't conceptualize such a thing. Let me hit you with something that really drives home how different their world was: the total absence of any kind of record keeping or external memory. You store information in writing, in photos, in recordings. You can externalize memory and access it later. Homo habilis had only their brains. Every piece of knowledge that mattered had to be memorized and maintained through constant use. If you forgot something, it was gone unless someone else remembered it. If everyone who knew something died, that knowledge disappeared forever. This meant their cultural knowledge was extremely vulnerable to disruption. A disease outbreak that killed older, more experienced individuals could set the group back technologically and socially. Loss of key individuals meant loss of expertise that might take generations to redevelop, if it ever was. But it also meant their memories were probably much better than ours. Without writing or external storage, they had to develop superior memory skills. They probably remembered vast amounts of information about plant species, animal behavior, tool-making techniques, social relationships, terrain features, all stored in biological memory and accessed when needed. Modern humans, with our external memory systems, have let our biological memory atrophy. We don't bother remembering things we can look up. We take photos instead of remembering scenes. We write things down instead of committing them to memory. If you were transported to the Homo habilis world, you'd quickly discover how poor your memory actually is. Without notebooks, phones, or any way to record information, you'd struggle to remember all the critical survival information you'd need. Which plants are edible? What do predator tracks look like? Where's the water source? How do you make that tool? Without external aids, you'd be constantly forgetting crucial information, making mistakes, relearning things you should already know. Let's talk about something that might seem minor, but would actually be a huge problem: the total absence of timekeeping. You know what time it is. You plan your day around specific times: meeting at 3 p.m, dinner at 6 p.m, bedtime at 10 p.m. Modern life is built around precise timekeeping. Homo habilis had no way to measure time precisely, no clocks, no calendars, no way to schedule events. Time was measured by natural cycles: day and night, moon phases, seasons. But these are approximate, not precise. This meant coordinating group activities required different strategies. Instead of "let's meet at the watering hole at noon," it was "let's meet at the watering hole when the sun is overhead." Instead of "I'll be back in 2 hours," it was "I'll be back before dark." This approximate timekeeping worked fine for their purposes because their activities didn't require precision. But for modern humans used to schedules and punctuality, it would be maddening. You'd never know exactly how long something would take, when someone would return, how long you'd been doing something. Your internal sense of time calibrated by years of clock watching, would be useless. Days would blur together. You'd lose track of how long you'd been there, how many days since various events. Without external time markers, your temporal orientation would deteriorate. This might seem like a small thing, but time perception is fundamental to human psychology. When you lose track of time, you lose a sense of control and order. Days become confusing, planning becomes difficult, anxiety increases. It's one of many small ways that Homo habilis life would be psychologically destabilizing for modern humans. Alright, let's wrap this up by addressing the elephant in the room. Could a modern human actually survive if they really tried? If you prepared, studied, trained, could you make it? Maybe. Maybe if you spent years preparing, learning primitive skills, building physical fitness, studying ecology and animal behavior, understanding plant identification, practicing stone tool making, you might have a shot at surviving for a while. But here's the thing. Even with all that preparation, you'd still be at a massive disadvantage because you're missing something that can't be learned in any reasonable time frame. The accumulated experience of growing up in that world. Homo habilis children started learning survival skills from birth. By age 10, they had a decade of direct experience in that environment. By age 20, they had 20 years of hands-on learning. By age 30, they were masters of their environment, with 3 decades of experience reading landscapes, animals, weather, social dynamics. You'd be starting from zero. Even with intensive preparation, you'd have maybe a few years of practice at best, and most of that would be in safe, controlled, modern environments that don't come close to replicating the stress and danger of actually living in the Paleolithic. The gap between academic/recreational knowledge and actual survival expertise is enormous. You can read about tracking animals, but that's completely different from actually following tracks across varied terrain while maintaining awareness of predators and coordinating with your group. You can practice making stone tools in a comfortable workshop, but that's different from having to create functional tools quickly in field conditions when your survival depends on it. And beyond specific skills, there's the entire psychological and physical adaptation to that lifestyle. The constant vigilance, the immediate threat assessment, the physical stamina, the mental toughness, the comfort with hardship and danger, the ability to make life or death decisions quickly. These aren't things you can train for. They're things you develop through years of actually living that life. So the honest answer is no. A modern human, even a prepared one, probably wouldn't survive long as Homo habilis. The world was too dangerous, the skills too specialized, the lifestyle too different from anything we can truly prepare for. But that's not a knock on modern humans. It's a testament to how extraordinary Homo habilis was. They survived and thrived in conditions that would defeat us. They developed technologies and social structures that allowed them to persist in one of the most challenging eras of human evolution. They were the pioneers, the first members of our genus, the ancestors who started us on the path to becoming modern humans. When you look at a Homo habilis fossil or a stone tool in a museum, you're not looking at primitive failure. You're looking at evidence of sophisticated intelligence, remarkable adaptability, and extraordinary toughness. These were survivors in the truest sense, living at the absolute limits of what was biologically and technologically possible. They didn't have our advantages, no language to share complex ideas, no accumulated cultural knowledge spanning thousands of generations, no technology beyond sharp stones, no medicine, no agriculture, no permanent structures, just their intelligence, their tools, and their determination to survive, and they did survive. For over 1 million years, Homo habilis and their immediate descendants persisted, spreading across East Africa, gradually improving their tools and techniques, slowly growing their brains and cognitive abilities. Every challenge they overcame made them slightly better adapted. Every individual who survived to reproduce passed on genes that were slightly better suited for that world. Eventually, they evolved into Homo erectus, then Homo heidelbergensis, then US. Every advantage we have, every cognitive ability, every physical feature that makes us successful can be traced back to selection pressures and survival challenges that Homo habilis faced. We owe them everything. Our big brains, our dexterous hands, our capacity for tool making and innovation, our social complexity, all of it comes from those early ancestors surviving the impossible. So yeah, you wouldn't survive a day as Homo habilis, but that's okay, you don't have to. They did it for you. They faced the dangers, endured the hardships, made the innovations, survived the challenges. They did the hard work of being early humans so that eventually their descendants could become us. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. Every time you use your hands to create something, every time you solve a problem creatively, every time you cooperate with others toward a common goal, you're echoing behaviors that started 2 million years ago with Homo habilis. They're in your DNA, your neural wiring, your behavioral instincts. You are their legacy. The fact that you exist, that you can think and create and wonder about your ancestors, proves that they succeeded. They won the ultimate game. They survived long enough for their descendants to inherit the earth. So when you think about Homo habilis, don't pity them for their hard lives. Respect them for their incredible achievements. They were the first humans, the pioneers, the ancestors who started the journey that eventually led to everything we are and everything we've accomplished. They wouldn't survive a day in our world with our technology and complexity and abstract thinking, and we wouldn't survive a day in theirs, with their predators and scarcity and immediate dangers. But that's the point. We don't have to because they already did. But let's dig even deeper into what made Homo habilis so remarkable, because understanding their world means understanding the specific challenges that would absolutely destroy modern humans. We need to get into the details, the day-to-day realities that most people never think about. Let's start with something basic but critical: thermoregulation. You probably don't think much about temperature regulation. Too hot? Turn on the AC. Too cold? Turn on the heat. Uncomfortable outside? Go inside. Your entire life exists within a narrow comfort zone that you can control. Homo habilis had no such control. They lived entirely at the mercy of environmental temperatures, and East Africa 2 million years ago had dramatic temperature swings. Daytime temperatures in the savannah could reach 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes higher. Nighttime temperatures, especially in the dry season, could drop to 50 degrees or lower. That's a 40 to 50 degree temperature swing within 24 hours. Your body, adapted to climate-controlled environments, would struggle enormously with these swings. During the day, you'd be fighting heat exhaustion and dehydration. Your sweat response, weakened by living in air conditioning, wouldn't be as efficient as Homo habilis. They had been selected for thousands of generations to have optimal sweating capacity for their environment. You haven't. Modern humans actually sweat more efficiently than almost any other mammal, which is great. But if you're not acclimated to hot conditions, your body doesn't regulate that response well. You'd either sweat too much and dehydrate rapidly, or not enough and overheat. Finding the balance takes weeks or months of acclimatization that you don't have, and during the day, you're not just sitting in the shade, you're walking, foraging, carrying loads, engaging in physical activity that generates internal heat. Homo habilis knew how to pace themselves, when to rest, how to minimize exertion during the hottest parts of the day. They had a lifetime of experience managing heat stress. You don't. You'd push too hard, overheat, become dizzy and disoriented. Heat exhaustion would set in, making you vulnerable, unable to think clearly or react quickly. And in that state, you're easy prey. Predators specifically target weakened individuals. A human stumbling around, clearly distressed, looks like an easy meal. Then night comes, and suddenly you're too cold. Without clothing beyond maybe some animal skins, without shelter beyond basic windbreaks, nighttime temperatures would be brutally uncomfortable. You'd shiver, losing precious calories to thermogenesis, unable to sleep properly, weakening yourself for the next day's challenges. Homo habilis bodies were adapted to these conditions in ways yours isn't. Their metabolic rate, their insulation from what body fat they had, their tolerance for temperature extremes, all of it was optimized through natural selection. They could maintain core body temperature efficiently across a wide range of conditions. Your body, softened by modern comfort, would be in constant distress. The temperature swings alone would sap your energy, disrupt your sleep, and weaken your immune system, making you susceptible to the diseases that were constantly circulating through Homo habilis populations. Speaking of disease, let's talk about the pathogen load in the Homo habilis world. You live in a relatively sanitized environment. Your water is treated, your food is cleaned and often cooked, you wash your hands, you use soap, you live in structures that keep out most disease vectors. Homo habilis lived in filth by modern standards. They walked barefoot through feces from countless animals. They drank from water sources contaminated with bacteria and parasites. They ate raw or minimally cooked food. They had no concept of hygiene or germ theory. They were constantly exposed to pathogens. But here's the thing. They had immune systems adapted to this pathogen load. Thousands of generations of exposure meant natural selection favoured individuals whose immune systems could handle the constant barrage of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Weak immune responses meant death in childhood. Strong responses meant survival and reproduction. Your immune system, despite being generally healthy by modern standards, isn't adapted to the specific pathogens of Paleolithic Africa. You've been vaccinated against modern diseases. You've been exposed to modern bacteria. But the specific strains of prehistoric pathogens, your immune system has never encountered them. The result would be that you'd get sick constantly. Stomach parasites from contaminated water would cause chronic diarrhea, dehydration, and malnutrition. Bacterial infections from cuts and scrapes would fester without antibiotics. Viral infections would hit you harder than they hit Homo habilis because your immune system doesn't recognize them. And remember, every illness makes you weaker, slower, less alert. Every bout of diarrhea dehydrates you and depletes your energy. Every infection diverts immune resources away from other functions. You'd be in a constant state of low-level illness, never quite healthy, always fighting something. Homo habilis dealt with this too, but they had much better adapted immune systems. They still got sick, still died from diseases, but their baseline resistance was higher. They could maintain functionality through illnesses that would incapacitate you. Let's talk about something else modern humans don't think about: the constant physical pain. Your body hurts sometimes. Sure, you get sore from exercise, maybe have chronic back pain from bad posture, whatever, but generally you exist in relative comfort. When something really hurts, you take painkillers. Homo habilis lived with constant pain. Their feet were calloused and scarred from walking barefoot over rocks, thorns, and rough terrain. Their hands were calloused from toolmaking and carrying. Their joints ached from the constant physical stress of climbing, carrying, running. Fossil evidence shows that Homo habilis had significant wear and tear on their skeletons. Arthritis was common, even in relatively young individuals. Bones show healed fractures, indicating they survived serious injuries but lived with the aftermath. Teeth show extreme wear from processing tough foods, probably causing chronic dental pain. They had no pain medication beyond possibly some plant-based remedies. They just lived with it. Pain was normal, constant, part of life. They developed psychological strategies for managing chronic pain that modern pain management specialists would find fascinating. Your pain tolerance, conditioned by a lifetime of pharmaceutical intervention, is probably much lower. You're used to being able to eliminate or reduce pain quickly. When pain is constant and there's no relief, it becomes psychologically devastating. It affects your mood, your decision-making, your ability to function. Chronic pain also increases stress hormones, which suppresses immune function, which makes you more susceptible to disease, which causes more pain. It's a vicious cycle that would spiral out of control for modern humans, unaccustomed to managing persistent pain without pharmaceutical help. Now let's talk about nutrition in more detail, because this is more complex than just find food and eat it. The human body requires a specific balance of macronutrients and micronutrients to function optimally. Get the balance wrong and you develop deficiency diseases. Homo habilis had to balance their diet without understanding nutrition science. They didn't know about vitamins or minerals or essential amino acids. They just ate what was available, and what experience taught them was good. Over thousands of generations, natural selection favored individuals who craved foods that provided the right balance. But this meant their diet was very different from modern diets. Much higher in fiber from plant foods, much lower in simple carbohydrates because refined sugars didn't exist. Moderate to high in protein from scavenged meat when available. Relatively low in fat, except when they could access bone marrow or organ meat. This diet, while nutritionally complete if they got enough food, would be absolutely brutal for modern digestive systems. Your gut microbiome, adapted to processed foods, would rebel. The high fiber intake would cause digestive distress initially. Your body would struggle to extract sufficient calories from tough, fibrous plant material. Homo habilis had different gut bacteria selected over generations to efficiently process the foods they ate. They could extract more nutrition from the same foods than you could. Their digestive systems were optimized for their diet in ways yours yours isn't. You'd be eating constantly but still losing weight, unable to extract sufficient calories from the available foods. Malnutrition would set in gradually. First you'd lose fat reserves, then your body would start breaking down muscle for energy. Eventually, you'd become dangerously underweight, weak and vulnerable. The micronutrient situation would be even worse. Vitamin deficiencies develop over weeks to months, causing specific symptoms. Lack of vitamin C causes scurvy, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, poor wound healing. Lack of vitamin D causes bone weakness. Lack of B vitamins causes neurological problems, fatigue, and cognitive impairment. Homo habilis got these vitamins from their varied diet, but they knew through experience which foods to eat when certain foods were available and how to process them to maximize nutrition. You'd be guessing, probably getting the balance wrong, developing deficiencies that would weaken you at the worst possible time. There's also the issue of food safety. You're used to food that's been handled safely, stored properly, cooked thoroughly. You know that raw chicken can make you sick, that you shouldn't eat food left out too long, that certain things need refrigeration. Homo habilis ate raw meat regularly, meat that had been sitting in the sun, meat that had been partially eaten by predators and was covered in bacteria, meat from animals that had been dead for hours or days. Their digestive systems could handle this. Yours can't. You'd get food poisoning repeatedly. The vomiting and diarrhea would dehydrate you, deplete your electrolytes, and weaken your immune system. Each bout of food poisoning would leave you more vulnerable to the next one, creating another downward spiral. Let's shift to something that might not seem important, but actually is: the complete absence of artificial light. You've lived your entire life with artificial lighting. You can be active 24 hours a day if you want. Your circadian rhythm is probably somewhat disrupted by light pollution, screen time, and irregular schedules. Homo habilis lived by natural light cycles. When the sun set, it got dark. Really dark. No street lights, no flashlights, no phone screens, just darkness, maybe firelight if they had fire, but probably not consistently. This darkness was absolute and terrifying. You couldn't see predators approaching. You couldn't see where you were going if you needed to move. You were essentially helpless until dawn. This is why nighttime was so dangerous, why they slept in groups with some individuals staying alert. Your eyes, adapted to artificial light, would struggle with the darkness. You'd stumble around, make noise, draw attention to yourself. Your night vision, weakened by years of bright lights, wouldn't be as effective as Homo habilis, whose eyes were adapted to natural light conditions. The psychological impact of this darkness would be significant. Modern humans are afraid of the dark, and for good reason from an evolutionary perspective. But we rarely experience true darkness. We've eliminated it from our lives. Being thrust into prehistoric darkness, knowing that lethal predators are active and you can't see them, would be psychologically traumatic. You'd probably struggle with sleep, hypervigilant in the darkness, jumping at every sound, unable to relax enough for restorative rest. This sleep deprivation would compound all your other problems, impairing cognitive function, slowing reaction times, weakening immune response. Let's talk about something modern humans completely take for granted: shoes. You wear shoes everywhere. Your feet are soft, pampered, protected. You probably can't walk comfortably barefoot on rough surfaces for more than a few minutes. Homo habilis walked barefoot everywhere, all day, every day. Their feet were incredibly tough, with thick calluses protecting them from rocks, thorns, and rough terrain. But even with these adaptations, foot injuries were common. Cuts, punctures, abrasions, all would happen regularly. Your soft modern feet would be shredded within the first day. Every step on the rough savannah would be painful. Thorns would puncture your soles. Sharp rocks would cause cuts. The constant walking would cause blisters that would burst and become raw wounds. These foot injuries would severely limit your mobility. You'd be unable to walk the distances necessary for foraging. You'd be slower, easier to catch if you needed to run from predators. You'd be a liability to your group, unable to keep up, requiring assistance that in desperate times might not be available. And foot wounds easily become infected. Without antibiotics and with constant exposure to dirt and bacteria, these infections would spread. You could develop serious systemic infections from something as simple as a thorn puncture. Sepsis from foot wounds was probably a significant cause of death for early humans. Now let's address something that would be psychologically devastating for modern humans: the total absence of control over your circumstances. You're used to having agency. Don't like your job? Quit and find another. Don't like where you live? Move. Uncomfortable? Change your situation. You have options, choices, the ability to shape your life. Homo habilis had almost no control. You couldn't choose a different lifestyle. You couldn't relocate to a better environment unless the whole group moved. You couldn't specialize in activities you enjoyed because everyone had to do whatever survival required. You had no options, no choices, no ability to shape your destiny beyond the immediate decisions of daily survival. This lack of agency would be psychologically crushing for modern humans. We derive meaning and satisfaction from feeling like we control our lives. When that control is stripped away, when you're just reacting to circumstances beyond your control, it creates learned helplessness and depression. The existential reality of Homo habilis existence was that you were at the mercy of forces vastly more powerful than yourself: weather, predators, disease, food availability, group dynamics. You could make small choices about immediate actions, but the broad trajectory of your life was determined by factors you couldn't influence. This would be especially hard for modern humans who've been taught that we can achieve anything if we work hard enough, that we're masters of our destiny. Confronting the reality that you're actually powerless, that survival is mostly luck and circumstances, would shatter that worldview. Let's talk about something specific that illustrates the difference between Homo habilis and modern humans: tracking. This skill was absolutely critical for finding food, whether hunting, scavenging, or even locating certain plant foods by following animal trails to water and food sources. Tracking means reading the landscape like a book. A disturbed pebble tells you something passed this way. A broken twig shows direction of travel. The depth of a footprint indicates the weight and speed of the animal. The age of tracks tells you how long ago they passed and whether it's worth following. Master trackers, which every adult Homo habilis had to be, can identify dozens of species by their tracks. They can tell the age, sex, and health status of the animal. They can predict where it's going based on the tracks and their knowledge of animal behavior. They can track animals across diverse terrain, through water, over rocks, through grass. This requires incredible observational skills honed over decades. It also requires extensive knowledge of animal behavior, terrain features, and how different ground surfaces hold prints. It's a sophisticated expertise that combines sensory acuity, pattern recognition, and predictive modeling. Modern humans, even those who study tracking academically, rarely achieve the level of proficiency that was baseline for Homo habilis. You'd look at tracks and see random disturbances. They'd see a story. A female antelope, young, limping slightly from an injury, passed here 3 hours ago, heading toward water, probably slowing down from pain and thirst. That information gap would be fatal. You couldn't find food efficiently. You couldn't avoid predators by reading their tracks and knowing where they were. You couldn't identify safe routes or dangerous areas. The landscape would be illegible to you in ways that made survival nearly impossible. Let's discuss something that might seem mundane but was actually critical: carrying capacity. You can carry things easily using bags, backpacks, carts, vehicles. You don't think much about the logistics of transporting goods because you have so many tools designed for this purpose. Homo habilis had to carry everything by hand or in simple bags made from hides or plant fibers. This severely limited what they could transport. A day's gathered food, a few tools, maybe a water container if they had one, that's about it. This meant they couldn't accumulate much, couldn't prepare extensively, couldn't transport resources efficiently. But more importantly, it meant that humans themselves were the only transportation system. Injured or sick individuals who couldn't walk had to be carried. Children too young to keep up had to be carried. Essential tools and resources had to be carried. This placed enormous physical demands on group members. Modern humans, weakened by sedentary lifestyles and unaccustomed to carrying heavy loads over long distances, would struggle enormously. Your back, your shoulders, your legs, all would be under constant strain. You'd develop repetitive stress injuries, muscle strains, joint problems. The physical demands alone would break down your body faster than it could recover, and there's no taking a day off to recover. If you don't forage today, you don't eat today. If you can't keep up with the group, you get left behind. The physical demands were unrelenting, day after day, week after week, year after year. Homo habilis bodies were adapted to this. Their muscle attachments show they were strong for their size, with powerful backs and shoulders from constant carrying. Their bone density was higher than modern humans, indicating higher mechanical loading throughout life. They were built for this in ways you're not. Let's talk about something that would drive modern humans insane: the complete absence of variety and novelty. You're used to constant stimulation and novelty. New foods, new entertainment, new information, new experiences. Your brain craves novelty because that's how modern life is structured. Homo habilis life was brutally repetitive. The same landscape, the same activities, the same people, the same challenges day after day, year after year. For your entire life, you'd probably never travel more than 50 miles from your birthplace. You'd see the same things, do the same things in an endless cycle. The only variety came from seasonal changes and occasional dramatic events like encounters with other groups or particularly dangerous situations. But the day-to-day existence was mind-numbingly repetitive by modern standards. Your modern brain, adapted to constant novelty and stimulation, would be understimulated. You'd become bored, depressed, desperate for something new or different. But there is nothing new or different. This is life. This is all there is, forever. Homo habilis didn't experience this boredom because their brains weren't wired for constant novelty seeking. They found meaning and interest in the subtle variations within their routine existence, the exact way the light hits the landscape at different times, the small differences in animal behavior, the nuances of social interactions. They were deeply embedded in the present moment in ways that modern humans, constantly planning and anticipating, are not. Your inability to find satisfaction in routine, your need for novelty and stimulation would be a serious psychological vulnerability in the Homo Habilis world. Let's address something dark but important: childhood mortality and its psychological impact. In the modern developed world, most children survive to adulthood. Childhood death is rare, tragic, and traumatic when it occurs. You probably expect that children will survive, that infant mortality is something from the past. In the Homo habilis world, childhood mortality was probably 50% or higher. More than half of children born didn't survive to adulthood. They died from disease, predation, accidents, malnutrition, exposure. Death was normal, expected, constant. If you had children as Homo habilis, you'd probably lose some of them, maybe most of them. You'd watch them die from things that modern medicine could easily treat. You'd be unable to save them, unable to do anything but accept their death and move on because the group couldn't stop functioning to grieve. This would be psychologically devastating for modern humans. We invest enormous emotional energy in our children. We expect them to survive. When they don't, it's one of the most traumatic experiences humans can face. It causes PTSD, depression, relationship breakdown, all sorts of psychological damage. Homo habilis parents loved their children too. We can see evidence of parental care in the fossil record, in healed injuries that required long-term care, in the survival of disabled individuals who must have been supported by their families. But they had to have some psychological mechanism for coping with likely child death, some way of emotionally protecting themselves while still providing necessary care. You don't have that mechanism. Your expectations, shaped by modern survival rates, would make each child death traumatic in ways that would accumulate, damaging your mental health, impairing your ability to function. And it wasn't just children, adults died too, regularly. Friends, partners, siblings, all would die from things that seem preventable or treatable now. You'd experience more death and loss in a few years than most modern humans experience in a lifetime. This constant exposure to death would either harden you in ways that would change your personality fundamentally, or it would break you psychologically. Either way, you wouldn't be the same person you are now. Let's talk about reproductive pressures, because this was fundamentally different from modern human experience. Today, reproduction is largely a choice. You decide if and when to have children. You can prevent pregnancy effectively. You can time births for convenience. Homo habilis had no contraception beyond extended breastfeeding suppressing ovulation. Reproduction happened naturally, frequently with little control. Women would have spent most of their adult lives either pregnant, nursing, or both. This placed enormous physiological stress on women. Each pregnancy depleted nutrient stores. Each birth carried significant mortality risk. Each nursing infant required additional caloric intake that might not be available. The cumulative effect of multiple pregnancies and births aged women rapidly and contributed to high female mortality. For men, reproductive success meant competing for access to females, either through physical dominance, social maneuvering, or successful provisioning. This created constant social pressure and competition that could turn violent. modern humans, removed from these direct reproductive pressures, would struggle with the reality of uncontrolled fertility, high infant mortality, and the social dynamics around mating and reproduction. Your expectations, shaped by modern reproductive freedom, would clash with the biological reality of constant pregnancy and birth. Let's discuss something that illustrates the cognitive differences. Abstract thinking and hypothetical reasoning. You can think about situations that don't exist and might never exist. You can consider alternatives, plan for contingencies, imagine different outcomes. Homo habilis probably couldn't do this effectively. Their thinking was likely much more concrete, tied to actual experiences and immediate situations. They couldn't easily imagine what-if scenarios or consider abstract possibilities. This meant their problem-solving was limited to addressing actual problems they were facing, using solutions they'd seen work before. Innovation happened slowly because imagining new possibilities was cognitively difficult. For modern humans, this would be like having your intelligence artificially limited. You can see solutions to problems, but you can't communicate them effectively because the language doesn't exist. You can imagine better ways of doing things, but you can't convince others because they can't think abstractly about possibilities. This would be incredibly frustrating. You'd feel like you were living among people who were cognitively limited, unable to grasp ideas that seem obvious to you. But the reality is that they weren't limited within their own cognitive framework. They just operated differently. And in practical terms, their concrete, experience-based thinking was probably more reliable for survival than your abstract reasoning. Your abstract thinking, valuable in modern contexts, might actually be a liability in immediate survival situations. You'd be thinking about hypotheticals while you should be responding to actual threats. You'd be considering alternatives when you should be executing the proven strategy. Your cognitive advantages don't translate to survival advantages in that environment. Now let's talk about something fundamental: the complete absence of hope for improvement. Modern humans live with the assumption that things can get better. If life is hard now, maybe it'll be easier later. If we work hard, maybe we'll prosper. We have hope for progress, for improvement, for a better future. Homo habilis had no such hope. Life was hard, and it would always be hard. There was no better future coming, no technological advancement that would make things easier, no possibility of retirement or leisure, just the same struggle, day after day, until you died. This sounds bleak, but it was also in some ways psychologically simpler. They didn't have disappointed expectations. They didn't waste energy hoping for changes that weren't possible. They accepted their reality and found meaning within it rather than looking forward to some improved future state. Modern humans would struggle terribly with this. We're psychologically dependent on hope. The belief that things can get better motivates us through hardship. Without that hope, many people would fall into despair. The existential reality of this is all there is, and it will never improve, would be crushing for modern psychology. Let's discuss one more critical difference: the relationship with death itself. Modern humans, especially in developed countries, are removed from death. It happens in hospitals, out of sight. Bodies are handled by professionals. Death is sanitized, hidden, something we don't deal with directly. Homo habilis encountered death constantly. They found dead animals, saw group members die, probably had to handle bodies. Death was visible, present, normal. They developed psychological frameworks for processing death that modern humans have largely lost. You'd be shocked and traumatized by your first encounter with violent death. Seeing someone killed by a predator, seeing the body, the blood, the reality of death would be psychologically devastating if you're not prepared for it. And you'd have to function afterward. You couldn't take time off to process trauma. You couldn't seek therapy or support. You'd have to integrate that experience and keep going because survival didn't pause for grief or trauma processing. The accumulation of these traumatic experiences would either break you or force you to develop psychological defenses that would fundamentally change who you are as a person. Either way, you wouldn't be the same person you were before. So when we put all of this together, every challenge, every difference, every adaptation that Homo habilis had and modern humans lack, the conclusion is unavoidable. You wouldn't survive. Not because you're weak or stupid, but because you're adapted to a completely different world. Homo habilis was adapted physically and psychologically to survival in one of the most challenging environments in human evolutionary history. Every aspect of their biology, from their immune systems to their pain tolerance to their cognitive processing, was optimized through natural selection for that specific lifestyle. You are adapted to modern life. Your biology is optimized for the challenges of contemporary existence, which are real but completely different. Transplanting you to the Homo habilis world would be like asking a deep-sea fish to survive in a desert. You're both successful in your respective environments, but completely unsuited for each other's world. But that's okay. You don't need to survive as Homo habilis because they already did that. They paid the price, endured the hardships, faced the challenges. They survived long enough to evolve into species that eventually became us. We inherited their toughness, their intelligence, their tool-making abilities, all refined and enhanced over millions of years. When you look at Homo habilis fossils or stone tools, you're looking at your ancestors. Not metaphorically, literally. Every person alive today descends from those early humans who survived impossible odds in prehistoric Africa. Their DNA is your DNA. Their survival is why you exist. So respect them, understand them, appreciate what they accomplished. They weren't primitive failures stumbling through existence. They were sophisticated survivors. The pioneers of humanity, the first members of our genus who started us on the path to everything we've become. They lived hard lives so their descendants wouldn't have to. They endured so we could prosper. They adapted so we could evolve. They survived so we could exist. That's the real story of Homo habilis. Not that they were primitive, but that they were extraordinary. Not that they failed, but that they succeeded against impossible odds. Not that they were less than us, but that they were the foundation upon which we were built. You wouldn't survive a day in their world, but you don't have to. They already won that battle for you, and that's something worth remembering. But there's even more to unpack about why the Homo habilis world would be utterly incompatible with modern human survival. We need to go deeper into the environmental context, the ecological relationships, and the sheer complexity of skills that made their existence possible. Let's start by really understanding the East African environment 2 million years ago, because this wasn't just Africa but older. This was a fundamentally different ecosystem operating under different rules with different players and different dynamics than anything that exists today. The The climate was in flux. We were in the middle of the Pleistocene epoch, when Earth's climate was oscillating wildly between glacial and interglacial periods. These weren't gentle transitions. These were dramatic shifts that could happen within a few generations, forcing rapid adaptation or death. During glacial periods, even though East Africa was near the equator, the effects were significant. Global temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns shifted. The Indian Ocean monsoon that brought moisture to East Africa weakened or changed direction entirely. Lakes that had been permanent water sources for thousands of years could shrink or disappear within decades. During interglacial periods, the opposite happened. Temperatures rose, rainfall increased, vegetation expanded, lakes refilled. But this wasn't necessarily easier for Homo habilis because different challenges emerged. More vegetation meant more cover for predators. More water meant more disease vectors like mosquitoes. Abundant food attracted more competition from other species. Homo habilis had to be flexible enough to survive both extremes and everything in between. They couldn't specialize for either wet or dry conditions because the environment wouldn't stay stable long enough. This required a generalist strategy that could adapt to changing conditions within a single lifetime. Modern humans struggle with this kind of flexibility. We're used to stable conditions, predictable patterns, the ability to plan based on relatively consistent environmental parameters. Being thrust into an environment that could fundamentally change within years would be cognitively and practically overwhelming. The landscape itself was different in ways that would shock you. The Great Rift Valley was younger, more geologically active. Volcanic eruptions were more frequent, occasionally covering vast areas in ash. Earthquakes were common, reshaping terrain unpredictably. The ground beneath your feet was literally unstable in ways modern humans rarely experience. These geological events created both hazards and opportunities. Volcanic ash made soil fertile, supporting rich plant growth in some areas, but it also buried food sources, contaminated water, and made breathing difficult. Homo habilis had to learn to read geological signs, to know when volcanic activity was increasing, when it was safe to remain in an area, and when to flee. The vegetation patterns were also fundamentally different. Modern African savannas are maintained partly by human activity, controlled burns, grazing patterns influenced by human presence, landscapes shaped by millennia of human habitation. The Pleistocene savanna was wilder, less predictable, shaped entirely by natural forces. Grasslands weren't uniform. They were a complex mosaic of different grass species, each with different seasonal patterns, different nutritional values for herbivores, different fire resistance. Homo habilis had to understand these patterns because they determined where herbivores would graze, which determined where predators would hunt, which determined where it was safe or dangerous for humans. Woodland patches were scattered across the savanna, providing crucial resources like shade, fruit trees, escape routes from predators, and materials for tools. But these patches were also dangerous. Limited visibility meant ambush predators like leopards could hide effectively. Dense vegetation concealed snakes and other hazards. Homo habilis had to balance the benefits of woodland resources against the increased predation risk. Rivers and streams carved through the landscape, but their courses were unstable. Seasonal flooding could completely reshape river valleys. New channels would form while old ones dried up. Waterfalls and rapids would appear or disappear. Homo habilis had to constantly update their mental maps of water sources, couldn't rely on memory alone because the landscape was changing. Lakes varied wildly in size and chemistry depending on rainfall and volcanic activity. Lake Turkana, a major feature of the East African landscape, would have been dramatically different 2 million years ago. Sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, sometimes fresher, sometimes more alkaline depending on volcanic inputs. The chemistry affected what fish and plants could survive, which affected what resources were available to humans. The animal community was staggeringly diverse compared to modern Africa. We've already discussed some of the predators, but the prey animals were equally remarkable and important to understand because Homo habilis survival was intimately connected to these herbivore populations. There were elephant ancestors like Dinotherium, with downward curving tusks and massive bodies. These weren't modern elephants. They were different species with different behaviors and different ecological roles. Hunting them directly was impossible for Homo habilis, but scavenging their carcasses provided enormous food resources if you could get access. Ancient giraffes called Civatherium were shorter and stockier than modern giraffes, with different feeding strategies that put them in different parts of the landscape. Understanding where these animals fed helped Homo habilis predict resource distributions. Hippos and rhinos inhabited waterways and wallows, and they were even more dangerous than modern versions. Ancient hippos were larger and more aggressive. Ancient rhinos included species with bizarre horn arrangements and different temperaments. Getting water from areas these animals controlled required sophisticated strategies and serious bravery. The antelope diversity was mind-boggling. Dozens of species, each with different body sizes, feeding strategies, herd behaviors, and defensive adaptations. Homo habilis had to know all of them. Which species were most vulnerable to specific predators, which could be approached more safely for scavenging, which had predictable migration patterns, which were most likely to be found near water. This knowledge was encyclopedic and essential. Getting it wrong meant wasting energy searching in the wrong places, missing opportunities, or walking into dangerous situations. Modern humans, even wildlife biologists who study these animals professionally, don't have the intimate, experiential knowledge that every Homo habilis adult possessed. There were also smaller animals that modern reconstructions often ignore but which were crucial to Homo habilis survival. Rodents, hyraxes, birds, reptiles all provided supplementary food sources that could mean the difference between starvation and survival during lean times. Ground squirrels and similar rodents could be caught relatively easily, providing small but reliable protein sources. Birds' eggs were seasonal bonanzas when available. Tortoises and large lizards were slow enough to catch and provided decent nutrition. Even insects, though nutritionally dense, required knowledge to collect efficiently and safely. Homo habilis children probably spent significant time catching these smaller animals. It was safer than participating in scavenging, taught valuable hunting skills, and contributed meaningfully to group nutrition. A child who caught a dozen rodents or found a bird nest contributed as much or more protein than an adult's share of a large scavenged carcass. Modern humans would probably be squeamish about eating many of these foods. We're conditioned to eat specific animals prepared in specific ways. The idea of eating rodents, insects, reptiles raw or minimally cooked would be psychologically difficult for many people. But in the Homo habilis world, you ate what was available or you starved. Psychological comfort was irrelevant. Let's talk more specifically about the predator-prey dynamics, because this was a complex web that Homo habilis had to understand and navigate constantly. It wasn't just avoid predators and find prey. It was understanding the relationships between all species and finding your niche within that complex system. Different predators hunted at different times. Diurnal predators like eagles and some cat species hunted during daylight. Crepuscular predators were most active at dawn and dusk. Nocturnal predators hunted at night. Homo habilis had to adjust their activities based on which predators were active and which were resting. But it was more complex than just time of day. Each predator had preferred hunting methods. Ambush predators like leopards preferred areas with cover where they could hide and strike suddenly. Pursuit predators like wild dogs preferred open areas where they could run down prey over long distances. Understanding these preferences helped Homo habilis predict where different predators were likely to be. Predators also competed with each other, and Homo habilis could exploit these competitive dynamics. When lions and hyenas fought over a kill, both species were distracted, creating opportunities for human scavengers to dart in and steal pieces of meat. When a leopard cached a kill in a tree, other predators couldn't access it easily, but Homo habilis could climb and steal portions. Predator territoriality created relatively safer zones. A territory held by one predator species was often avoided by competing predators, creating areas with lower overall predation risk. Homo habilis groups probably learned the boundaries of various predator territories and planned their movements accordingly, but these territories shifted as dominant individuals died, as prey populations moved, as environmental conditions changed. Keeping track of all this required constant observation, communication within the group, and updating of mental maps that charted not just physical geography, but also the dynamic social geography of predator territories. The prey animals also had complex anti-predator strategies that Homo habilis had to understand. Herding species used collective vigilance, with many eyes watching for threats. Approaching a large herd, even of herbivores, was risky because they'd stampede if alarmed, and getting caught in a stampede could be fatal. Some antelope species used flight as their primary defense, exploding into rapid escape runs at the first sign of danger. Others used hiding, freezing in tall grass and relying on camouflage. Others used aggression, with large males defending herds with sharp horns that could eviscerate a predator or human. Homo habilis had to read animal behavior constantly. A herd that was relaxed and feeding indicated relatively low predator presence. A herd that was alert and jumpy indicated predators were nearby. A herd in rapid motion indicated an active hunt was happening. Each of these scenarios presented different opportunities and dangers. Vultures circling indicated a carcass below, but you had to interpret which type of vultures and their behavior to determine whether the carcass was fresh enough to be valuable, whether the predator that made the kill was still present, and whether other scavengers had already claimed it. Modern humans don't read animal behavior at this level. Even experienced wildlife observers focus on one or two species and don't integrate all the information from dozens of species simultaneously to create a complete picture of the current ecological situation. For Homo habilis, this integration was automatic, constant, and essential. Let's discuss the seasonal cycles in more detail because these created rhythmic patterns that structured Homo habilis life, but which would be difficult for modern humans to anticipate and navigate. The wet season brought advantages and disadvantages. More plant foods became available as things grew. Water was plentiful, but travel became harder as ground turned muddy. Diseases spread more easily in humid conditions. Insects swarmed. Many animals gave birth during or just after wet season, meaning young, vulnerable animals were available, but also that adult animals were more protective and aggressive. The dry season also had pros and cons. Travel was easier on hard ground. Disease transmission decreased. Insects were less problematic, but water became scarce and highly contested. Plant foods diminished. Animals congregated around remaining water sources, intensifying both predation and competition. Dust storms reduced visibility and respiratory health. The transition periods between seasons were particularly challenging. Weather became unpredictable. Resources shifted locations. Animals migrated, creating moving targets. Some species moved out of an area entirely, while others moved in, completely changing the local ecological dynamics. Homo habilis had to anticipate these transitions and adjust their strategies accordingly. They probably had traditional seasonal movement patterns, spending wet season in certain areas and dry season in others, following a circuit that optimized resource access year-round. But these patterns couldn't be rigid because climate variability meant some years were wetter or drier than average. A drought year might force them to stay near permanent water sources rather than following their usual circuit. An unusually wet year might allow them to exploit areas that were normally too dry. This flexible seasonal planning required sophisticated cognitive abilities. You had to remember past years, compare current conditions to historical patterns, predict future conditions based on current trends and adjust plans accordingly. This is complex temporal reasoning that requires good memory and pattern recognition. Modern humans could probably do this intellectually, but we lack the experiential data. You haven't lived multiple cycles through these seasons, haven't built up the database of environmental patterns that allows accurate prediction. You'd be guessing, making decisions with incomplete information, getting it wrong more often than right. Let's talk about intergroup dynamics in more depth because this was another layer of complexity that was critical to survival, but which modern humans would struggle to navigate. Homo habilis groups weren't isolated. They were part of regional populations with complex social relationships. Some neighboring groups were friendly, others hostile, most somewhere in between. Managing these relationships was essential for long-term survival. Friendly relations with neighboring groups provided multiple benefits. Information sharing about resource locations, predator activity, and ecological changes helped everyone survive. Mate exchange maintained genetic diversity and created kinship bonds between groups. Mutual defense against hostile groups or large predators increased everyone's security. Trade of resources, tools, or specialized materials gave access to things not locally available. But maintaining these friendly relations required ongoing effort. Regular visits to reinforce bonds, gift exchange to demonstrate goodwill, participation in shared activities or rituals, careful negotiation when conflicts arose, all took time and energy. Hostile relations with other groups were dangerous but sometimes unavoidable. Competition over prime territories, particularly those with reliable water, could turn violent. Past conflicts created ongoing feuds that perpetuated hostility. Some groups might have been culturally or linguistically different enough that cooperation was difficult. Managing hostile relations required constant vigilance. You had to know where hostile groups were, anticipate their movements, avoid their territories when possible, and be prepared to defend yourself when avoidance wasn't possible. This added another layer of threat assessment to daily life, another source of potential danger beyond the environmental and predatory threats. The social intelligence required for all this was substantial. You had to track relationships between multiple groups, remember past interactions and their outcomes, understand the current dynamics and how they might shift, and navigate complex social negotiations where mistakes could be fatal. Modern humans, even those skilled at social navigation, would struggle with this because we're used to more formal social structures. We have laws, contracts, mediators, formal institutions that structure intergroup relations. Homo habilis had none of this, just face-to-face relationships, memory of past interactions, and the immediate social dynamics of each encounter. You'd likely make social mistakes, misread situations, offend potential allies, or show weakness to potential enemies. These mistakes could get you killed or get your entire group killed. The stakes for social competence were extraordinarily high. Let's discuss toolmaking in even more detail, because this was the foundation of Homo habilis' success, and modern humans dramatically underestimate how difficult it actually was. We've talked about basic older one tools, but there were variations and subtleties that required real expertise. Not all flakes were equally useful. The angle at which the flake detached from the core determined its shape and sharpness. The type of stone determined how well the edge would hold up. The size and weight determined what tasks it could perform effectively. Master toolmakers could predict these outcomes and shape their strikes accordingly. They could look at a piece of raw stone and visualize the finished tools it could produce. They could adjust their technique mid-process based on how the stone was fracturing. This is real-time problem solving at a very high level. There were also specialized techniques that went beyond basic flaking. Bipolar reduction involved placing the core on an anvil stone and striking from above, creating different flake patterns useful for different purposes. Pressure flaking used antler or bone tools to precisely remove tiny flakes, refining edges for specific tasks. Heat treatment of certain stones altered their fracture properties, making them easier to work. We don't know for certain if Homo habilis used all these techniques, but evidence suggests at least some sophistication beyond simple percussion flaking, and they definitely understood raw material quality. They could identify good tool stone and they transported it over considerable distances, sometimes carrying raw materials for miles to have them available when needed. This curation and transport of raw materials shows future planning and understanding of resource distribution. You don't carry heavy stones for miles unless you know from experience that you'll need them and won't be able to find suitable material where you're going. This is complex spatial reasoning combined with predictive planning. Tool maintenance was another skill modern humans don't think about. Stone tools dulled with use, edges chipped or broke. Effective tool use meant knowing when to resharpen, when to rejuvenate an edge through additional flaking, and when to discard a tool and make a new one. This judgment came from experience and directly affected efficiency. A modern human, even one who'd learned basic flint knapping, wouldn't have this experiential knowledge. You'd keep using tools that were too dull, waste time resharpening tools that should be replaced, make poor decisions about tool selection for specific tasks. These inefficiencies would add up, making you much less effective than a Homo habilis with decades of tool making and tool using experience. Let's talk about wounds and injuries in more detail, because the reality of dealing with trauma without modern medicine would be horrifying for modern humans. Cuts were constant. Working with sharp stone tools meant cutting yourself regularly. Processing animal carcasses meant knives slipping and causing wounds. Walking barefoot meant stepping on sharp objects. These weren't occasional injuries. They were daily or weekly occurrences. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, every wound was a potential infection site. Some infections remained localized, causing pain and swelling but eventually healing. Others became systemic, spreading through the bloodstream and causing fever, delirium, and often death. Homo habilis had to have some knowledge of wound care, probably using certain plants with antiseptic properties, but their treatments were limited. Broken bones were particularly problematic. A simple fracture of an arm or leg bone, if it healed straight and the person survived the healing period, might not be permanently disabling, but many fractures were more complex. Compound fractures, where bone-pierced skin almost always resulted in infection and death. Fractures that healed crooked left permanent disabilities. The fossil record shows Homo habilis individuals who survived serious injuries, broken legs that healed, skull fractures that healed, even individuals with developmental abnormalities or disabilities who survived to adulthood, indicating group support. But these successful recoveries were probably outnumbered by unsuccessful ones that didn't leave fossil evidence because the individuals died. Sprains and strains were also problematic. A modern sprained ankle is painful but manageable. You can rest, use ice and elevation, take anti-inflammatories. A Homo habilis with a sprained ankle still had to walk, forage, and keep up with the group or risk being left behind. Minor injuries that would be inconveniences today could cascade into life-threatening situations then. Dental problems were particularly nasty. We've talked about tooth wear, but there were also abscesses, broken teeth, and gum disease. Dental abscesses are excruciatingly painful and can spread infection to the jaw, face, and eventually bloodstream. Many Homo habilis probably died from dental infections. The pain from these various injuries and chronic conditions would be constant and severe. Modern humans with access to pain medication still struggle with chronic pain. Homo habilis endured without pharmaceutical help, developing mental strategies for pain management that we've lost. They probably had some plant-based pain remedies. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Other plants have mild analgesic or anti-inflammatory properties, but these are weak compared to modern drugs. The pain relief would be partial at best, so they lived with pain. They functioned through pain. They worked, travelled, cared for others, all while dealing with chronic pain that would send modern humans to the emergency room. This physical and mental toughness is something we've completely lost. Let's discuss the psychological dimension of constant physical challenge in more depth. Modern humans are used to comfort. When we're uncomfortable, we fix it. Too hot, air conditioning; too cold, heating; hungry, eat; thirsty, drink; tired, rest. Our default state is comfort, and we actively work to maintain it. Homo habilis' default state was discomfort. They were often too hot or too cold, often hungry or thirsty, but unable to immediately satisfy those needs. often tired but unable to rest because conditions weren't safe or tasks weren't complete. Physical discomfort was normal, constant, to be endured rather than eliminated. This creates a completely different psychological baseline. Modern humans become distressed when basic comfort needs aren't met. We experience that unmet need as a problem requiring immediate solution. Homo habilis experienced those same sensations but interpreted them as normal background noise, not urgent problems. This difference in psychological baseline would make modern humans feel like they were constantly suffering in the Homo habilis world. The discomfort that they found normal would be psychologically devastating for you. You'd be focused on your discomfort, distracted by your unmet needs, unable to function effectively because your brain is screaming that something is wrong that needs to be fixed. Homo habilis brains weren't screaming. They were adapted to evaluate discomfort differently, to distinguish between normal discomfort that could be endured and dangerous discomfort that required immediate action. A modern human wouldn't have this evaluation system properly calibrated. Everything would feel urgent, overwhelming, impossible to manage. The accumulated psychological stress of constant discomfort, constant danger, constant loss, constant pain would break most modern humans within weeks or months. PTSD, depression, anxiety, all would develop from the relentless stress. And without therapy, medication, or even the concept of mental health treatment, these conditions would spiral, making you increasingly non-functional until you couldn't survive. Homo habilis didn't develop these conditions, or at least not at the same rates, because their psychology was adapted to their environment. The same experiences that would traumatize modern humans were processed differently by brains that expected hardship and had frameworks for making meaning from suffering. Let's talk about the social roles and specialization in Homo habilis groups, because this was more nuanced than simple division by age and sex. And understanding your place in this social structure would be critical but difficult for modern humans. There was certainly some division of labor by sex and age. Women, especially those pregnant or nursing, probably did more gathering and less scavenging of dangerous carcasses. Men probably did more of the confrontational scavenging and risky activities. Children contributed at age-appropriate levels, starting with simple gathering and working up to more complex tasks. But there was also likely some individual specialization based on aptitude and interest. Some individuals were probably better toolmakers than others. Some were better trackers. Some were better at social negotiation. Some were stronger or faster or more perceptive. These individual differences were recognized and utilized. The best tool makers probably spent more time on tool production. The best trackers probably led foraging expeditions. The best social negotiators probably handled intergroup relations. This wasn't formal specialization like in complex societies, but informal recognition of individual strengths. Modern humans are used to choosing our careers and specializations based on interests and aptitudes. We have freedom to develop our strengths and avoid our weaknesses. In the Homo habilis world, everyone had to be minimally competent at everything because survival depended on it. Specialization was a luxury that emerged only after basic competence was achieved. You'd be starting from zero in all skills, while others were specialized masters building on decades of baseline competence. You'd be a clumsy beginner at everything. This would place you firmly at the bottom of the social hierarchy, dependent on others, unable to contribute meaningfully for a long time, if ever. Your modern specialized skills, valuable in contemporary contexts, would be useless. Being good at mathematics or knowing lots of historical facts or being skilled at programming doesn't help you survive on the Paleolithic savannah. All your education and expertise, the things you're proud of and that define your identity, would be irrelevant. This would be psychologically devastating. Your entire sense of self-worth, built on modern competencies, would be invalidated. You'd be objectively less capable than every other adult in the group. This status anxiety, combined with the physical challenges, would create overwhelming psychological stress. Let's discuss the temporal experience of Homo habilis life, because this was fundamentally different from modern human experience of time and would be disorienting in ways that would compound all other challenges. Modern humans have precise time measurement. We know not just the time of day, but the date, month, year, century. We can place ourselves precisely in time, look back at history and plan forward into the future. Our experience of time is linear, progressive, measured. Homo habilis experienced time cyclically, days repeated in similar patterns, seasons cycled predictably, life events, births, deaths. They happened but weren't marked on any calendar. There was no concept of historical progress, no sense of time beyond living memory, no planning beyond the near future. The day was divided roughly by sun position. Early morning, midday, late afternoon, evening, night. But these weren't precise. Midday could be a 2-hour window. Late afternoon was approximate. This imprecision didn't matter because their activities didn't require precise scheduling. The year was marked by seasonal changes, but these weren't named or numbered. It was wet season or dry season, described by current conditions rather than by position in an abstract calendar. Time passed, seasons changed, but there was no accumulation, no count, no sense of, this is year 453 of something. Your lifespan wasn't measured. You didn't know your age. You were a child, then an adult, then old. That was it. No birthday celebrations, no awareness that you were 35 years old. Just awareness of your current state and your position in the life cycle. This would be disorienting for modern humans who are used to precisely locating ourselves in time. Not knowing the date would be strange. Not knowing your age would be stranger. Not knowing how long you'd been there or how long until anything would be psychologically untethering. You'd try to keep count, to track days and mark time, but without writing or external aids, you'd lose count. Eventually, you'd have to accept the same temporal ambiguity that Homo habilis lived with. This loss of temporal precision would feel like losing part of your identity. Let's discuss one final critical element: the complete absence of explanatory frameworks for natural phenomena. Modern humans understand causation. We know why it rains, why people get sick, why the sun rises and sets. We have scientific explanations for natural phenomena. Homo habilis didn't. They had no concept of germs or weather systems or planetary rotation. Natural phenomena just happened, without explanation, unpredictably from their perspective. Rain came or didn't. People got sick for no apparent reason. Animals behaved in ways that seemed random. This might seem primitive, but it also meant they didn't waste cognitive energy trying to explain things. They observed patterns, learned what usually happened in certain situations, and made practical decisions based on those patterns. They didn't need to know why something worked, just that it did. Modern humans would struggle with this absence of explanation. We want to know why. When something happens, we need a reason, a cause, an explanation. Living in a world where things just happened without knowable causes would be cognitively frustrating. You'd probably develop your own explanatory theories, but they'd be wrong because you don't have the information or framework to develop accurate ones. These wrong theories might lead to poor decisions, making you less effective at survival, or you'd struggle with the cognitive dissonance of not understanding why things happened. This uncertainty, this lack of control through understanding, would be another source of psychological stress, adding to the overwhelming pile of challenges. So that's it. That's why you wouldn't survive a day as Homo Habilis. Not one reason, but hundreds of reasons, each individually challenging, cumulatively impossible. Every aspect of their existence required adaptations you don't have, skills you haven't developed, psychological frameworks you haven't built. They were extraordinary. We are different. Both are valid. Both are successful in their contexts. But those contexts are so different that success in one doesn't translate to the other. Understanding this, really grasping how challenging their world was and how adapted they were to meet those challenges, should give you immense respect for these early humans. They weren't primitive failures, they were sophisticated survivors who laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Every advantage you have today, every comfort, every capability can be traced back through millions of years of evolution to ancestors like Homo Habilis, who survived impossible odds. You exist because they were tougher, smarter, and more adaptable than seems possible. So the next time you complain about your Wi-Fi being slow or your coffee being cold, remember Homo Habilis. Remember what real hardship looked like. Remember what humans are capable of enduring and overcoming. Remember that you carry their legacy in every cell of your body. You wouldn't survive their world, but you don't have to. They already did that for you, and that's worth honoring.